Yo, so this is the second installment of 10-minute histories. Now, today I'm going to be talking about Ludwig van Beethoven, so the composer, the Beethoven. So he's regarded as a transitional composer between the classical and the romantic period, and his exact date of birth is unknown. He was baptized on the 17th of December 1770, so a lot of 17s, but in Bonn, Germany, and to an alcoholic father, and he started composing at around age 12 and started performing even earlier at about age 7. And he moved to Vienna in 1792, so this was when he was about 22 years old, and he stayed there for the rest of his life, actually. And he was a master of many different genres of music, of piano music, orchestral music, and, ensemble music. He was very popular amongst the people of his day, but he never married or had any kids. And some say he was very average looking, and amongst other things, he was apparently pretty belligerent and not the nicest person to be around, according to many reports. Now, this will be more clear why this is later on. So he actually stopped composing for 2 years when he was in a custody battle over his nephew Karl, and he actually won custody of Karl, but they had a very strained relationship, and Karl actually eventually tried to commit suicide, was unsuccessful, but ended up surviving only to leave the army, to go to the army. And in 1801, Beethoven started losing his hearing, so for a composer to not be able to hear would be catastrophic. So this was in 1801, so this was about age 31. And by 1817, he was completely deaf, so this was about age 47. And but interestingly enough, many of his greatest compositions were composed when he started actually losing his hearing, and even after he was basically completely deaf. And some of his most well-known works is the Symphony Number 5, or the Fifth Symphony. Bum, 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 bum. Everyone knows those 4 notes. I think it's one of probably the best-known works, and especially symphony-wise, along with the Choral Symphony, which is his 9th symphony, which is, most people know it as an Ode to Joy. It's also very, very well known. His 6th symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, and interesting story about the 3rd symphony, was initially called Bonaparte, but as a homage to Napoleon. But Beethoven eventually became disillusioned with Napoleon, and on the original manuscript paper you can actually see how he scrambled and erased the name Bonaparte and renamed it Eroica, which means heroic, so the Heroic Symphony. So that's the 3rd symphony. So his best known is the 5th, 3rd. The 3rd isn't that well known, but it's the 5th and the 9th, in my opinion, I would say. And some of his most well-known piano pieces is the 14th Piano Sonata, the Moonlight Sonata, and the 8th Piano Sonata, the Pathétique Sonata. And he allowed other composers to break free from prescribed standards and musical forms, and he seriously widened the scope of symphonies, of quartets, of concertos. He really paved the way forward for a lot of the composers who were to follow him. He really kind of broke out of the box, and died at age 56. So not that old. And another one of his most well-known pieces, for example, for release, was completed in 1810, but it was only published 40 years after his death. And for release means for Elise, and some believe it was written for Therese Malfatti, to whom he had actually proposed around that time. Around the time of completing the composition, so around 1810, he had actually proposed to this Therese Malfatti, and others say it was a German soprano named Elizabeth Rockel, but it really could have been a student. It could have been it could have been probably not a fan, might have been a student, a patron, a friend, who knows. And his 7th symphony premiered in 1813 in Vienna to benefit wounded soldiers from the Battle of Hanau. So that's pretty interesting. So a charity concert basically for the benefit of wounded soldiers. His Missa Solemnis is a Catholic mass, and it spans 90 minutes, so hour and a half, so massive work. String Quartet number 14 is 40 minutes of music that consists of seven movements that are linked and played without breaks. So kind of groundbreaking as well. Now, something we learned about during our studies were his conversation books, where because of his the fact that he lost his hearing, he had many conversations literally written down, where he would write down conversations with people. People would write down questions, he would reply in papers. So we actually have a lot of insight from his mind and how he felt, for example, because of all these conversations that are literally written down in these books. They call the conversation books. They're very interesting to me. And in 1801, in a letter to a friend, he's quoted as saying, "I must confess that I lead a miserable life." And he continues to say he finds it impossible to say to people, "I am deaf." And continues where he says that for a composer to be deaf is, he mentions that if it was another occupation he was in, it wouldn't have been that difficult, but for a musician to be deaf is bad. Is bad. It's such a terrible word to describe it. It's terrible. But yeah, and he only wrote one opera, Fidelio, and just an interesting fact, Beethoven himself actually thought he was born in 1772, so not 1770, and he would actually refuse to believe people who would show him official documents stating that he was actually born in 1770. So he actually thought he was 2 years younger than he actually was. And we're pretty sure about the date of his birth because the law was you had to be baptized within 24 hours of birth. So if he was born on the 17th of December, you can assume he was, or if he was baptized on the 17th of December, you can assume he was born probably a day or two beforehand, at most. And neighbors testified that apparently as a child they would hear him practicing and crying because his dad was very, very strict and also an alcoholic and would force him to practice, hoping that he would be the next kind of wunderkind similar to Mozart. So apparently he was put under a lot of pressure as a kid, and he was performing by age 7, and I know his dad sold him as a 6-year-old because that was when Mozart really performed his first piece of music, and he did perform at age 7, but it wasn't not to the fanfare that Mozart did. But also just interesting, I thought worth mentioning, is that the guy was an average student in school. So he wasn't the greatest student, so I think that's something everyone can take home is, you don't have to, how can I say this? I guess, a diamond doesn't always shine from the beginning. Like, sometimes you have to, slipe. Not the greatest student, now he's a legend. And just for interest's sake, he also studied under Haydn and Salieri, and he was a virtuoso pianist, virtuosic pianist, and performer as well as a composer, which is just, I think, worth noting as well. And there was something I actually it was so difficult to write down and so long that I just took a photo of it, so I'm just going to read it to you as well because I thought it was interesting. And dated October 6, 1802, and referred to as the Heiligenstadt Testament. It reads in part, "O you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic," not exactly sure, sorry about that word, "how greatly do you wrong me? How do you do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you, and I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back. It seemed impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me." So sorry for my terrible reading, but just the fact that he was so depressed, he was thinking of leaving this world, but he felt he still had so much music in him. So pretty interesting. That for a variety of reasons, including his crippling shyness and unfortunate physical appearance. Beethoven never married or had children. He was, however, desperately in love with the married woman named Antoni Bernard Brentano. Antoni Brentano. Over the course of 2 days in July of 1812, Beethoven wrote her a long and beautiful love letter that he never sent, addressed to you, my immortal beloved. So there was actually a movie made about this. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it. The letter said in part, my heart is full of so many things to say to you. There are moments when I feel that speech amounts to nothing at all. Cheer up, remain my true, my only love, my all as I am yours. So, pretty interesting that, and despite his extraordinary output of beautiful music, Beethoven was lonely and frequently miserable throughout his adult life. Short-tempered, absent-minded, greedy, and suspicious to the point of paranoia, Beethoven feuded with his brothers, his publishers, his housekeepers, his pupils, and his patrons. In one illustrative incident, this I find very funny, Beethoven attempted to break a chair over the head of Prince Lichnowsky, one of his closest friends and most loyal patrons. Another time he stood in the doorway of Prince Lubkovsky's palace shouting all to hear, Lubkovsky is a donkey. So obviously he had, there was a lot of, he was probably not the easiest person to be around. But you can understand for a deaf person, for a musician to be deaf has to be terrible. And I've seen a few documentaries on him and stuff where, they would show little apparatuses he would use to try and just hear some of his music, where it was something similar to like a French horn coming out of your ear, out of both ears, to just like try and amplify some of the sound. And there are quite a few interesting stories of him. One where he would constantly have a cane and he would tap, 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 tap on the floor while he's practicing piano, but he was staying on the second floor, so the people at on the bottom floor would constantly hear duk, 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 and apparently when he got warm he would just take a bucket of water and just throw it over his head, and this would obviously leak through to the bottom floors. And one time his landlord apparently came to the place he was staying, and he had a big guy there breaking out a wall, and apparently he said no, he wanted to watch the sunrise over Vienna in the mornings while he's playing piano, or something along those lines. But yeah, so that's just Beethoven, a short history of Beethoven. And amazing composer, led a very difficult life, but still today it just goes to show, I think once again, not all heroes wear capes, and at some stages, like everyone is average, and everyone has it in them to be extraordinary, I guess. Cool. So that's today's section of today's news. I'm in a big hurry, so I can't I made a lot of mistakes, but I can't do this over again because I'm pretty late for work. Well, not late, but if I don't leave now, I'm gonna hit traffic at its worst. Yeah, gotta hit the road now. Cool, so thanks for listening. Catch up soon. Yeah, and just so one part of Beethoven's story I forgot to mention was with his ninth symphony, it was known as a choral symphony because it had a choral section where there was a choir singing. So this was completely unconventional for a symphony, because a symphony would usually be a work for an orchestra, not for a choir, not even for orchestra and choir. So this was kind of unprecedented. So when the choral section, what can you say, debuted, or when they performed their section, the crowd stood up and gave Beethoven a standing ovation. So because he was deaf, he didn't hear this standing ovation happening, and he was directing the orchestra from obviously with his back facing the audience. So he wasn't in time with the orchestra, obviously, because he couldn't hear them. So the entire orchestra would just listen to the first violinist, and would follow the first violinist, take his cue, and so forth. So when the first violinist saw this the standing ovation, he took Beethoven by the coattail and just pulled him and said, turn around. So when he turned around, he saw the entire audience standing up and clapping hands, and he just took a bow and continued, waving his stick like a crazy person. And so that's just a cool story, I think, is worth adding to that. So, cool.